Are AI companies using regulation to block competition? A little bit like the person that's behind in school cheating and they can only compete by cheating. We see the same thing is happening with AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. They're using fear tactics about foreign competition to get government protection. And this really rings familiar if you were a person growing up in the 90s. There was the Microsoft Halloween documents, and this was from the famous monopolist Bill Gates, and he created this FUD campaign against Linux and open source, saying that it was communism and that it was scary and that all these boogeymen were going to come and get you if you use Linux. Now, it turns out in the year 2025, over 90% of the global infrastructure uses Linux. So not only was Bill Gates and Microsoft completely wrong, but they were predatory and they were stopping innovation. I think we can see the same thing happening with OpenAI and Anthropic. They're using fear tactics, FUD, about foreign competition to block what's happening. And also they want to get government protection so that they don't have to compete. And really what we're seeing is they're afraid open source AI is going to prove their technology isn't special at all, and it's going to become a commodity because in perfect competition, all profit leads to zero. And that's what it looks like is going to happen with OpenAI and also with Anthropic. Now let's take a look at OpenAI's tactics from a recent article. The CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, who used to work for Y Combinator and is very familiar with rent-seeking behavior, right? Essentially taking a revenue without providing value. He's calling the Chinese AI lab DeepSeek state-controlled. But just like many other claims about artificial intelligence is going to be smarter than PhDs, even though it's just a pattern matching system inside a vector space and it doesn't make sense, he's also making unvalidated claims about state control over DeepSeek. The information that appears in public is the opposite. We see that DeepSeek is a hedge fund, that people are releasing their software methodologies, they're releasing all of the weights. They are actually much more open and much more transparent than OpenAI, and these are unvalidated or even spurious claims. We also see that the OpenAI CEO wants the US government to ban these PRC produced models in allied countries. So again, it's very strange. What do you mean ban open source software? Are you Microsoft in the 1990s? This is a very weird thing to do. Also, how do you ban something that is already open source? It's not even possible. It doesn't make sense. And there's also a claim of a security risk, despite the fact that open models don't have any form of data collection. How do you steal or create a security risk? Now, it's true there's some deep ways to embed flaws, etc. But if people have access to the weights and they can look at it themselves and reverse engineer it, and you're explaining your methodologies, the risk is much, much lower. And we know that in a wide open space where lots of people can contribute to open source, that there's less probability of backdoors. Now, if you look at what also has happened is that previously, even they accused DeepSeek of stealing knowledge from their models. Now, this is a little bit strange because there are ongoing lawsuits against OpenAI for IP theft. There's evidence that pirated books, at least allegedly, are used in training the models. And we know that with Meta as well, there's evidence that these companies are targeting pirated data sets. So if it's the case that they're accusing one company of stealing their knowledge, wouldn't they themselves be guilty of the same thing because the original data came from a stolen source? So it doesn't really make sense. We also look at Anthropic's approach here as well. The CEO is claiming $100 million secrets and just a few lines of code that spies want. And let's just stop on that for a second. So the Anthropic CEO has made some very strange claims recently. One was that in 6 months, 90% of all code will be written by these coding assistants and 100% in a year. But that doesn't make sense as well, because we know that, again, these large language models are simply pattern matching in vector space. So it would be like saying, because I can do k-means clustering and I can create a cluster, that I don't need a financial advisor, right? It doesn't make sense, right? It's just a pattern that is being matched. You still need a human to be involved. So this could be just yet another panic from the CEO, where they feel very threatened that their company is not going to be profitable. All of the magic they originally had is going away. And so now they're claiming yet another strange thing, which is that there's $100 million in secrets in just a few lines of code. My intuition would tell me that if your company is only in business because there's a few lines of code that spies want, it's strange for a couple reasons. One, it's strange because aren't you proving that intellectual property is valid, right? So isn't it the case then that people should want consent, whether you take their books or their art, etc.? So that's very hypocritical, A. B, if the only way that your company is able to compete against another company is a few lines of code, that means your company is built on a house of cards, right? There's no reason your company needs to have any valuation that's in excess of just an open source model. And in fact, you can make the case that maybe the true value of your organization is zero. Now let's talk about China conducting large-scale industrial espionage against AI companies. This is also a little bit strange. I mean, that's a claim that needs to have a lot of evidence. So if you're going to make that kind of accusation, you also need to have the evidence to back it up. We don't have any evidence of this. Likewise, wouldn't you say that scraping intellectual property is creating large-scale industrial espionage against the entire world, right? The United States, Europe, China, all these other places that create intellectual property. If you're taking their content, scraping, getting beyond firewalls and taking their content, isn't that also espionage? And then we also have the claim from Anthropic that the government, including intelligence agencies, need to protect the leading AI companies, which again is very strange. Are you saying that your product is designed to be a data collection device for intelligence agencies? If that's the case, that doesn't feel good to be using closed source large language models. In fact, you're making the case for the opposite, that people should gravitate more towards open source models, just like there's open source operating systems like Linux that don't include spyware that sends all your data to some intelligence agency. Likewise, why don't people move to models that run on their machine where they're not getting surveillance capitalism as the business model? And then finally, we have this claim as well from the Anthropic CEO that the export controls on AI chips should be increased, and we need to really stop people from using our chips. Again, very strange behavior, considering the fact that in one way you could be creating a competition on chips by limiting your chips to another country, or even encouraging more efficient ways to do things. So it's a very weird and strange series of statements from Anthropic that, in my opinion, really diminish the value of the organization that was starting to differentiate itself from OpenAI, which is, I would say, quite scammy in that they were a corporate B and they're trying to be a little bit more responsible, but maybe they're just very afraid. So really, in a nutshell here, I think what we see is that the real fear, if we go and use our critical thinking skills, is that the competition is killing their profits. And so open source AI is getting better much more quickly and costs much less. And so if anyone can run good AI models, and it does appear to be the case, it's unlimited competition, the big companies lose their advantage. And the companies that are operating at a loss have to somehow maintain this illusion of unique value. And if the illusion disappears, they could rapidly lose value and then potentially go bankrupt. And now this is where the government protection could help maintain this artificial scarcity and high prices. So unfortunately, it's a sign of weakness to hear these kinds of things from these companies. And then finally, if we get into the parallel for Microsoft, it's uncanny because Microsoft has been caught in the past using fear, uncertainty, and doubt, called FUD. And these were leaked emails where they specifically tried to use this against Linux. And again, now something like 30 years later, we see that in fact, not only were they wrong, but Linux is so superior to Microsoft that the global infrastructure runs on Linux. We also saw with Microsoft during that time, they claimed that open source was insecure and unreliable. Sound familiar with the Halloween docs? But the real concern was that they're fearing the commoditization and that software is becoming standardized and cheaper. So likewise, these Gen AI companies are really fearful that there is no reason for them to exist. And then the AI companies are also using national security as a business security as well, just like Microsoft did. So, what are the policy consequences here? Is that the innovation would potentially get concentrated in just a few companies and would limit the advancements in this new technology. The international cooperation on AI safety would become harder because there's this, jingoistic nationalism, and then the public resources are going to get diverted to protect private company rent seeking, which is already a big problem in the United States. There's a lack of competition. We see trillion-dollar companies, which is a sign that really the monopoly legislation is not effective. And if we look at the regulatory barriers, it's going to hit the smaller players and it's going to hit open source projects the hardest. So really, if you sum this up, these companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, it's very predictable. They want regulation to protect their profits, not to protect people. And the national security is just an excuse for suppressing the competition. And they're scared of open source because it proves that there's nothing they're doing that cannot be reproduced. And the end game really is to prevent AI from becoming a commodity with razor thin margins. So when you hear these kinds of things, it's really people that are very, very afraid to compete because they know they cannot win.